If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. I grew up in a hollow in a pretty small town in rural West Virginia. The hollow is roughly 3 miles long, but surrounded by family-owned forest land, at least 10 acres or more deep in every direction. The only homes located on the hollow were all family. We lived in the very last house on the road. We were the dead end of the road, and our closest neighbor was an uncle, about 200 yards down a field. My brother and I grew up very poor, so we spent most of our free time outside, roaming the woods and whatnot. I remember so many times wandering around in the woods when it would just fall silent around us. Birds suddenly stopped chirping. Little animals stopped rustling in the leaves. Just complete silence. We always took that as our own personal signal to head home, like the woods were saying, "That's enough for today." As kids, we never thought much of it, but now, recounting this story, it definitely makes sense. My brother and I grew up apart as we went to middle school, so we didn't spend a lot of time together in the woods anymore, and mostly stayed in our own rooms like preteens do. One evening, though, our parents decided to go out for a little bit, and leaving my brother and I with nothing to do. We decided to take a little hike for old time's sake. I was around 12 and my brother about 14, so this was roughly June 2004 or 2005. He had picked up cigarettes as a habit, so I credited his idea to head into the woods and as an excuse to smoke freely and not have to worry about our parents popping in and catching him or smelling the smoke. We headed out and hiked a pretty decent distance from home, definitely far enough to keep his nicotine habit a secret from our parents and way out of sight. We decided to stop and sit for a bit. It was mid-evening and the sun was dimmer, but left us enough time to hang out for a while and make it back home with enough time to spare before it was dark out. He set into smoking his cigarettes, and I had picked up a stick and was just whacking plants and digging in the dirt. We were having short bursts of conversation, but mostly sat there, lost in our own thoughts. After about 30 minutes of sitting there, that strange silence fell over us, and we looked at each other to gauge if the other thought we should head back like we used to as kids when it got quiet out there. My brother just shrugged and lit another cigarette, so I went back to digging in the dirt, lost in my own business. I was feeling a little uneasy, but figured I was just being a chicken because my brother seemed completely unbothered. It was so silent I could hear my brother calmly breathing across from me and could even hear the tobacco crackle when he took a draw off a cigarette. I heard a little rustling that sounded a little off in the distance and some twigs breaking. We literally grew up in the woods and were taught about all kinds of wildlife by our hunter of a father. I credited the rustling to a deer or a coyote off a ways from us and never looked up. A few minutes later, though, something caused me to look up. The calm breathing I had heard from my brother seemed to catch in his throat. I jerked my head up to see what was wrong with him. His face was pure white, and he was looking a little to my right and back behind me. Normally, I would have laughed it off because my brother loved trying to scare me and play little pranks. But the look on his face was pure horror. I turned my whole body in the direction he was looking. About 50 or so yards away was a creature. This thing was standing on 2 legs and stood every but of 7 foot tall. Even at the distance, it looked huge. I backed toward my brother without taking my eyes off this thing. It looked like it was covered in fur, dark brown or black. I'm not sure about the eyes since we were just far away enough not to make out the smaller details, but if the sun had hit them, I can guess they would have been yellow or gold. We kept gaze with it for what seemed like hours, even though it couldn't have been more than a minute or two. It didn't move the whole time we stared at it to this point. It was like sizing us up as we were it. After what seemed like an eternity, which was probably only 3 or 4 minutes by now, it kind of huffed at us. It wasn't a growl or a snarl. It just seemed to be testing us to see how we would react if it threatened us in some way. We stood concrete still. It then dropped on all fours and took on a single awkward step toward us, like it wasn't moving on all fours, but wanted to seem animalistic. Again, we did not move. After being told all your life not to run from predators or they will chase you, we were not risking a race with this thing. It took one more clumsy step toward us. When we didn't budge, it took off in the opposite direction. As soon as it was completely out of sight, we darted toward home. I don't think we had ever cleared the woods so quickly in our lives. We burst through the front door and locked it behind us. We just collapsed in the living room and never spoke of it again. This is my grandfather's story. Way back in the 80s and 70s, my grandfather used to work as a mechanical engineer for the Army. He was stationed and worked in a special base that he will not disclose the location of. He did say, though, that this base was around the Georgia area, but miles out in the middle of nowhere. His job was to work on several different pieces of equipment, as well as a vast array of other miscellaneous tasks. He tells me it was quite often that they would constantly be having issues with these wolf-like creatures attacking soldiers as they left and entered the base. He explained that they were fairly tall with very large muscles and human-like legs. I showed him the werewolves from the movie Dog Soldiers, and he told me that not quite, but they look definitely similar. Especially since that's the only movie where I've seen them have human-like legs, and he told me the legs were on point. He also mentioned how all of these things were that it aligned with the height of the werewolves in that movie. That's the closest he's been able to describe these things to me. He said one time, one almost got in as one soldier was leaving, and that its head was nearly blown off by a few of our snipers. These animals were nocturnal, and would use that to their advantage. He said he doesn't recall any of his fellow troops being killed, but his sergeant was attacked and left with a huge scar down his back and face. This had occurred over the course of 4 months, and got to the point to where these creatures were noted as kill on sight. They would only come out at night, and they would stalk and walk around the perimeter. It's almost like they were looking for a weak point to get in. As soon as they became kill on sight, they stopped coming around, and I don't remember if he said anything about seeing them after, but I don't think he did. He got transferred only 6 months after the initial sighting to another part of the country, and didn't keep tabs on anybody in that base at the time. However, he tells me that some of his old buddies from other bases around the country doing similar lines of work had mentioned similar occurrences. One of his closer friends, who was also a mechanical engineer as well, is long passed away now. But this friend at the time was working out of the Southern Oregon base out there. He said that there was constant howls off in the distance at night, with wood knocks and other strange, bizarre noises he could not explain. One of the patrolling soldiers had a near-death encounter with what he could only describe as a giant ape-man thing a few miles outside of the base. This creature smashed the front end of his vehicle to the point to where it was no longer operable and had to flee on foot. My grandfather has other crazy tales about similar things happening, but after all that, he had never had anything else happen to him. I've owned my house now for a good 10 years and have never noticed this problem until just last spring. I have a good portion of my yard up front that I have set up for a 24 by 24 vegetable garden. Nothing extravagant, but it allows me to grow my onions, peppers, basil, and tomatoes. I've had this vegetable garden set up since I moved in and never seen such a creature in my life. It all began in the spring. I would go out in the morning and tend to my vegetables, and I couldn't help but notice the continuous feeling of a bad omen. This feeling would just start in the pit of my stomach and take over, and I could never figure out why exactly. This went on for weeks, and the feelings only intensified. I believe it was around early May when I discovered a pair of eyes staring at me from around 8 feet off the ground, not too far off into the thicket. In that very moment, I vividly remember watering my dahlias and turning to look, and there were these yellow glowing eyes. Initially, I didn't take it as fear because I had to register that it was actually eyes looking at me, and then I realized that these eyes were very high up and attached to something rather large. I panicked and dropped my watering can and ran for my house and locked my doors. I did not go out of my garden the rest of the day. I began to feel uneasy, even in my own house. I felt like I was always looking for these pair of eyes. I kept my curtains and windows closed after that. Things seemed to die down for a little while until about a couple weeks later, when I step outside my house in the evening and noticed this big gray hairy shape off in the woods to my right. I made a beeline for my car and drove out of there. I'm sure I left smoke in the gravel. I returned the following morning without noticing anything out of place. This is where I start to notice this animal really watching me. After that, this thing started getting closer and closer. I first got a real good look when it started to charge at me when I was working on painting my fence by my vegetable garden. I heard this loud crash bang, and as I looked over, this massive gray walking wolf on 2 legs is charging right at me. I fled in fear and locked myself inside my house and kept all of my knives near me. I called the police, but they said they couldn't help me, and then I just needed to be careful of the wildlife around, like to not leave food out, don't provoke them, etc. So much for that. June did come, and I would catch this thing looking in my windows. Luckily, I never saw it directly because I kept my curtains closed, but they were thin enough for light and shadows to come through, and I would see the silhouette of a massive wolf head in my windows. It would take every ounce of me not to scream, and the experience was traumatizing in its own. As summer drew closer, there would be nights I could sense it was outside my house, pacing or just waiting. I didn't really know who I could turn to or what I could do. Things stayed about the same until about mid-July, when I remember suddenly things just stopped. The feeling of evil had disappeared, and I was able to go back out to my garden peacefully. I stayed on high alert for weeks afterwards, thinking it was a trap, but I have yet to still encounter this creature. I still live in the same house as of now, and I'm writing this to you. It's January 14th, 2020. My only fear is that this thing will return come the spring, when it's time to tend my garden once again. Do you have any ideas of how I can get rid of this? Something really strange is going on here. I'm writing this to you because I believe there's a Dogman in my neighborhood area. Over the past 6 months, all the pets in the neighborhood have been vanishing left and right. I am surrounded by animal lovers and know that my surrounding neighbors have many pets. I've been asked so many times in the past couple of months if I know where their animals have gone, and I've seen all the missing pet papers. I've never been in this sort of situation before, and originally chalked all of this up to be a mountain lion. Upon further research, I ended up falling down a rabbit hole which led me to the Dogman phenomenon. I had read several encounters and heard things through Vic's channel about people experiencing similar things. Their pets going missing, finding animals mutilated, etc. I can't say that's entirely what this is, but I just have a feeling. For the record, I live in Ohio, and there's a big creek that runs near us about 2 or so miles away from the general neighborhood. I don't know if that helps at all, or if that makes the Dogman more inclined to hang around here. I'm not so sure. I'm just looking for answers. I'll never forget the day my grandfather passed away. This would have been January 2009. My grandfather and I were very close, largely in part to my father passing away at a very young age due to medical complications. I don't really remember my father a whole lot, but I grew up extremely close to my granddad. At the time this happened, I was 26 and working a local security job. My grandfather lived about 2 hours away from me. Keep in mind, this was in the dead of winter, and there was a lot of snow and ice on the roads. I got the call early in the morning, about 5 a.m., that he never woke up. My grandfather is usually up at 3 in the morning, and goes to bed at like 6 or 7 in the evening. I fly in my car out to my grandparents' house. Because they live so far out, there's certain old highways and roads I have to take to get to them, and with the snow and ice in the early morning, it becomes a very treacherous situation very fast. As painful as it was losing my grandfather that day, something else happened to me that terrified me to my core. I'm almost to my grandparents, and I'm pulling up on this long dirt road which is around 6 miles, with their house near the end. They lived in the sticks, and I'm surrounded by pine and fir all around me. I see what I can make out to be a large animal eating a dead deer in the middle of the road. I pull up slowly, and this thing turns around and stands up on 2 legs. Now let me explain something. As I pulled up to it, it looks weird to begin with, because it looked as if it was half man, half wolf, crouching, and I was seeing its backside. But once it turned its head at me and stood up, I slammed on my brakes. I gasped in fear. This thing did not stare at me more than 2 seconds before it crouched ever so slightly and leapt up into the air and disappeared. I couldn't stop screaming and slammed the acceleration so hard I nearly lost control of the car and crashed. I somehow managed to fly down the snowy, icy road without crashing, eventually reaching my grandparents' house only minutes later, or so it felt. There was already an officer on site at the house, and several of my other family members since they didn't live too far away. Even though I was overwhelmed by sadness and despair, I pulled the police officer aside and asked him if he saw anything driving up here, and the cop just looked at me strangely and told me no. Nothing else was said, and I comforted my grandmother, and my family stayed with us there for a few days to take care of my grandmother. Part of me wonders if what I saw that night was the evil that followed him around. My grandmother would tell me multiple times that he had this darkness surrounding him, and she never really elaborated, so I always understood that as just a figure of speech for bad luck. But maybe she meant something more. I found out a little later on that when he was much younger, he dabbled in witchcraft for a very short while. I have no idea if what I saw is related to all that, but judging by what I've researched from the encounters that I've read, I can only make an educated speculation. Around summertime, back in 2015, and me and a close bro of mine were startled beyond words when we heard a strange growl walking on the backside of his property. Told about the supposed Dogman that lives in Wisconsin, but always thought of it like a cruel joke parents told children. This was nearby some woods, so you know this happened out in Rock County in Wisconsin. It's actually fairly close to Bray Road. If you don't know anything about Bray Road, I would suggest you look that up. The Bray Road event started the entire werewolf phenomenon that people report seeing, to my knowledge. Anyway, when we heard this weird growling sound, I turned to my bro and said, "Do you hear that?" He nodded yes. We were both scared out of our wits. Neither of us have ever heard an animal like that, and we spent a lot of our time outside. This growling continued and was coming towards us. I noted for my bro to start back towards his house, and this tall canine-like figure steps out of the woods, walking our way. It looks like a large canine with pointy ears. I couldn't see any eyes or really other features besides that. It looked to be about our height and a slender build if I had to guess off memory. Its strides were humongous, and I remember only looking for a few seconds before my buddy and I sprinted back to our house and grabbed a shotgun. Well, his shotgun. All I had was a .22 on me, and I knew that wasn't going to do shit to this animal. We waited by the door for this animal to approach the house, and we knew we weren't going to fight off this animal had it broke in, but we were going to try. Not too much longer later, we heard this thing come up to the house, and what sounded like it stood entirely still. We knew it was stalking us, so we kept the house on lockdown all night long. This thing never attempted to attack us nor the house. In the morning, we went out to look for tracks and found massive canine tracks all over the property and the house. I turned to my bro and told him he needs to up his firepower game. This creature has been coming back to his property, even up until now. He's had to shoot at it several times, but it never attacks him or his house. What makes him nervous is that it's getting really close, almost like an animal that's far too curious. My mom ended up moving out to the country after my father passed away years ago. She continued to stay in the house they're living in for a while until she found a nice little small house. In the back, it had several acreage and a hill that led down to a tiny little wooded creek. I was over at her house helping her move and unload when my sister, who's around 16 at this time, comes running back to the house screaming. She kept screaming that there was a tall black shape walking around on 2 legs around the creek, growling in her direction. Not sure what to make of it, my mother just told her not to go back there anymore. I guess after that, this thing would follow my sister around. It would look into her window at night and stare at her, and when she would get in and out of her car. When she ended up going off to college at 18, this thing seemed to disappear. I'm more intrigued about it than she is, and I guess after a while, it still scared her, but she learned to ignore it. I never saw it with my own eyes, but she just told me in depth about it. I am a believer in the unexplained and paranormal, and I believe that something attached itself to my sister. Spent the weekend camping with my brother and family at a packed campground during the weekend. Well, I should say that this happened back in 1996, so this didn't just happen. Anyway, there was a really large man-made lake that my brother and I desperately wanted to explore. My brother and I were only 17 and 15 when this happened. My parents were pretty strict on what we could and couldn't do, even though we were almost of adult age. Luckily for my brother and I, we waited until they fell asleep, around 10 p.m. We snuck out of our tent and went around to explore. It's pretty sad when you're 17 and your parents still helicopter you and give you a hard time, but I guess they were just nervous about us, either disturbing other people or God knows what. Being summertime, there were still a lot of people up and fires going on when we decided to take a couple of the nearby trails after hanging out by the man-made lake. We talked to a few people here and there, making small talk and enjoying the night together. I think at some point we got offered booze but declined. There were quite a few really cool trails around the area, and being 17 and 15, we felt indestructible and decided it was a good time to go night hiking without any sort of light other than our tiny camping flashlights. There is this one really cool trail that extends out quite a ways and then loops back around to the other side of the campground, totaling 2 miles if I remember correctly. It's like a big horseshoe, but the big horseshoe extends into the national forest and then back around. We got on the trail around 10:45 p.m. and only saw a few other people walking their dogs. We were pretty much the only ones there, so it made for fun. I had stolen a cigarette from my father, and I was going to smoke it once we got far enough down the trail. We had been walking for probably around 20 minutes, and everything around us was dark and quiet, since we were in the forest part now. My brother started to complain that maybe we should have gone back, and that if Mom and Dad wake up to us not being there, we were going to be grounded for the rest of our lives. I told him to calm down and that we would be fine as I lit up my cigarette. My brother was just being stupid and paranoid at times, so I just ignored it. We continued walking and decided to pick up our pace a little to make good time, because I did not want to be back super late either. We got to a point in the trail where it kind of goes up this little hill that curves around and then dips back down again. My brother grabbed me and stopped me in panic, saying that somebody was out there in the woods trying to scare us. I laughed at him, thinking he was trying to pull a fast one, and yelled out to the woods, "If anybody's out there, we're so scared," and kept laughing. This was all a joke to me, and I would soon find out that it wasn't. My brother shushed me, and we both listened. He wasn't lying. I began to hear shuffling noises in several different places around us in the woods. I'm terrible at judging distance, so I couldn't tell you how far away it was, but it sounded close by. I heard a few bits of shuffling to the right of me, and to the left. My brother began panicking, thinking we were about to get jumped, or some crazy axe murderer was going to kill us. I told him to calm down and let's just keep walking. As we began to walk up this hill, the noise still continued, but it began getting closer to the trail, and closer to the spot we were when we stopped. I told him to just keep picking up his speed, and when we reached the top of the hill, he turned around, screamed, and took off sprinting. In that second, I knew something was terribly wrong, because my brother, who used to be super lazy, and for him to take off sprinting, he must have been spooked. Thinking he was just being melodramatic, I turned around and shone my small flashlight in the direction that he screamed. And down on the trail where him and I both heard the initial shuffling noises, were these two huge dog-like figures standing on two legs. The first thing I noticed when I shone my light was the pointy ears and the red glow of the eyes. I couldn't tell if they emitted a red glow from the reflection of my flashlight into their eyes, or they just had an unnatural, evil glow to them. Either way, I froze. My flashlight wasn't great, so it was pretty dim shining that far away, but enough that I saw their faces. They were ugly. It reminded me if you crossed a hyena with a wolf and stuck it on a bodybuilder human body. Huge bodies. I thought these two things were demons coming to get me. They just stared at me. I dropped my flashlight and I sprinted as fast as I could, following after my brother and not saying a word. I ran for my life. I've never felt such mortal danger before. Time began to slow down dramatically, and I felt like I was running in a time warp. After what seemed like running for an hour, I made it out on the other side of the trail back to the campground. Turns out we're actually only about a mile away from the end of the trail, so we had walked a good ways before we had saw what we did. I collapsed on the ground shaking when I got to the trailhead entrance. Between the outermost fear and danger and absolute exhaustion, my body was overworked. If these demons were following me and coming to get me, there is nothing I could have done. I felt helpless and alone. Things around me started to get really quiet, and I didn't hear any of the shuffling noises I was hearing earlier. I picked myself back up and fled to my tent, where my brother was already curled in the fetal position, sobbing. I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't even make eye contact with me, let alone acknowledge me. Neither of us got much sleep that night, if at all, and my parents never knew we even left. Again, this happened back in '96, and to this day my parents don't know what happened. I tried to figure this encounter down as to demons that were coming to get us, but now that I know a little bit more about cryptids and creatures out there that exist, I wonder what's really around there. A little more insight as to the location. I can't really remember the campground because we were doing this long road trip thing with my dad for his business at the time. It was somewhere around Indiana, I believe. That encounter has stayed with me ever since, and I've never been so fearful of my life before. My mom recently began getting very sick, and so I've had to come and stay with her to be her caretaker. I've been her caretaker now for about 7 months. She's still able to get up and get around, but not a whole lot like she used to. I'm her only child, so I'm obligated to give her the support that she needs. Now, this happened just last month, in December. We live quite a ways out of town on a lone road that is surrounded by pine on both sides. You take a right down about half a mile, and her house is to the left. She has some neighbors, but they are more spread out. We are the first house on the street. There's a lot of logging around this area and has been for some time. I know on the other side of the road beyond the pine was some new construction going on. They were clearing trees for more development. Since this was in December, it gets dark fairly early, like 4:30. This happened probably around 8 p.m. if I remember right, at night when my mother was driving home from the grocery store just to pick up a few things. I hear her park and run faster than I've ever heard her run to the door and slammed it shut. I look over and her face is pale white, and she looked like she had just seen a ghost. I asked her what was wrong, and she tells me she hit the biggest dog she's ever seen in her life. She went to tell me that she was pulling into the road, and this humongous dog ran across the road, and she collided with it. She was too scared to get out and check for damage, so she just drove right here. Confused and concerned, I ran outside with the porch lights on to check if there was any severe damage. I didn't see any immediate damage, dents, or any scratches of any kind. However, there was this long stringy hair all over the front of her Ford Escape, and in the front grille. Bizarre, but I've never seen any kind of dog like what she described. I don't even think any of our neighbors close by have any dogs that I'm aware of. She obviously hit something. I grabbed a handful of the stringy hair and brought it to her and asked her if this belonged to what she had hit. She said yes. I can't explain this for myself, nor is there really any evidence to point that this is anything other than the ordinary, but it's still rather strange. When I asked her to give me more details on what she saw, she explained to me that it was just gray and dark in color, and about the size of a moose. I don't know if I necessarily believe her, but this is just what she relayed to me. This last winter, I was doing some hiking in and around the Appalachian Mountain area. I discovered what I believed to be Dogman tracks. I even made casts of the tracks that were in the wet, cold winter mud. These were huge prints, easily the size of a lion's paw. I believe they're Dogman prints because I've been an avid outdoorsman and an avid Bigfoot researcher until only in the past couple years when I've been hearing more and more about this Dogman creature appearing all over. I became increasingly fascinated with this concept and began seeking any evidence I could find, even if it meant running into these things face to face. I have a couple of close friends who are also cryptid researchers as well, and so I sent the cast to them, wondering what their thoughts were. One of my close friends, we'll call him David for the sake of the story, began to tell me about these upright black wolves that roam around this 78-acre plot of land he goes to hunt at. It's state game land, and I don't remember exactly how he gains access to it, whether it be illegally or legally. Either way, he tells me he's seen them down there quite a bit looking through his scope. These things must really feed heavily on deer, because there's a wholesome amount of doe in that area, with the occasional buck that comes through. The numbers have dwindled in the years, but it's still a semi-decent place to hunt in the deer season. David, like I, has been a heavy-duty researcher and a fan of Bigfoot and cryptids. To my knowledge, he did not know about the Dogman cryptid until I told him about the casts that I made and sent them to him, and then proceeded to tell me what he had been seeing every fall. He stays a great distance away from these creatures, unsure of what they're capable of. I'm going to try and set up a way I can fly out to him, and he could take me to this area so I can see them for myself. Wish me luck.